Hey there, everybody. So I'm here with my good friend Daniel Burke, and we are going to have a chat about the danger of a new world war, the potential change of the conversation around the world, what's going on with Russia and China. So we're going to play our introduction video, and then we'll get started here.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right. Well, welcome, Daniel. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I really love your new intro video. That's great.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, we're transitioning. I'm going to be on Rockfin pretty soon, so we're
Right.
transitioning how we do these streams. So
Mhm.
hopefully that introduction and many more like it will be used in the future. But you and I have been friends for a long time now, and you work with the Schiller Institute. You've run for office in New Jersey several times, and you and I thought it would be good to have a stream about global events and kind of the danger of a new world war. The threat of the situation, what people really don't seem to understand about all these hysterical allegations about Russia that just won't stop from our mainstream media. So why don't you go ahead and start things out? But before you get started, I do want to tell people Daniel and I will be answering your super chat questions. So if you have a super chat question for me or Daniel or both of us or one of us, just do it. I'll be writing it down as we go. So go ahead, Daniel. What's on your mind?
There have been these extremely emphatic statements from Russia. For example, yesterday, Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, about the actual conditions that we're in, which I think is accurately called a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis. Although even though, in a certain sense, that's too catchy. I mean, it's really dangerous. We're really very close to a war breaking out. There were a series of meetings between the United States and Russia, between NATO and Russia, and these took place over the past week. And in those meetings, which were basically initiated by Russia, the Russians put forward two treaties, one for NATO and one for the United States. And they said, we need an answer in writing about these things. And Lavrov underscored that today, that the time is running out for us to get a written answer about our demands, which have to do with halting and halting the eastward expansion of NATO, which has been advancing, as everyone knows, for since the end of the Warsaw Pact, at which point really NATO should have been disbanded. But instead, there was a verbal agreement, there was a promise from James Baker III to Gorbachev that he said, we're not going to expand eastward at all. And that promise has been, of course, just trampled upon. And you can look at many images of the eastward expansion of NATO over that time period. But what you're talking about is, basically the way that Putin had expressed it back at the end of December is, you are at our doorstep. We don't have anywhere else to go. And it's within that context that the Russians are simply loudly declaring what anyone who is rational would understand, namely that the emplacement of certain offensive weapon systems in Ukraine and other places right on the border of Russia, and the efforts the policy of what could become ethnic cleansing in eastern Ukraine of, I think, about 500,000 people there who have Russian passports, that these are a line which cannot be passed. The response has been abysmal from the United States, from NATO officials. There have been some indications of a willingness to actually have the conversation, which at least there's that. Biden took the phone call from Putin not that long ago, a couple of weeks, I suppose, at this point. They had the meetings. They've said, okay, perhaps we'll be willing to have future meetings. But at the crucial time period when there should be a response from the United States to these treaty proposals and so forth, you have the attempted color revolution in Kazakhstan, which cannot be seen as other than a provocation in the midst of this process. And you have the present claims of the potential of a false flag by Russia to, get pretext for Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is published in major newspapers today or yesterday, and went through, was based on a single anonymous official, as far as we can tell, and was signaled really the day before by Jake Sullivan as being a likely mode of interruption, disruption of this process. So what we're faced with is, I think, an expression of something much larger, which is a kind of a civilizational crisis that we're in. Namely that it's not one thing, it's not another. In the midst of this, you have, the incredible ineptitude of the United States relative to COVID. You have the hyperinflation happening, including in the gas markets, and for people's heating and their ability to actually take care of themselves through the course of the winter. In Europe, in the United States, you have a really catastrophic situation in Africa, South America, in many other parts of the world, in Southwest Asia, that is happening partially because of the effects of the economic breakdown that's generally happening, the incredible increase in the price of food in every country in the world, but it's also a matter of the disastrous effects of the regime change policies and the wars that we have been waging. And so we've reached, I think, the very limit of this system. My view, I find myself in agreement with the founder of the Schiller Institute, the chairwoman, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is really trying to advance to people the view, the hypothesis, the grave, concern that we have really no further to go, and that therefore there must be a fundamental shift in the axiomatic approach of the West, away from this policy of the rules-based order, and actually a return to international law, a return to natural law, a return to a respect for sovereignty and for the individual human life. So I can say more on that, but
Well, there's a couple things that stand out there, Daniel, that I just can't let go. First things first, right? So U.S. media is all hyped up that Russia is planning some kind of false flag. Wait a minute. Wait a second. Hold up. False flags don't happen. Anyone who says false flag is a conspiracy theorist, right? You're supposed to immediately, the second you hear anybody ever say false flag, you're supposed to cover your ears and go, I'm not listening. Oh, it's a conspiracy theory. It's not true. That's Alex Jones. That's the right. Now U.S. media, they're using the word false flag like it actually happened. So false, it's okay to accuse Russia of false flags. But if you think that the American government might do a false flag, then it's a conspiracy. Then it's unacceptable. I mean, can you believe how hypocritical they are with this? I mean, I have been told explicitly, I've heard numerous mainstream media voices say there is no such thing as a false flag. If someone says false flag, that's a conspiracy theory. And now they're accusing Russia of planning a false flag. Meanwhile, that's the first thing I wanted to bring up. Second thing I wanted to bring up, right? So we're constantly hearing about Russia being the aggressor, right? Now, I think people need to get out a map because a lot of folks don't have very good geography skills. So, hey, I mean, we have an awful educational system in the United States. We have a mainstream media that makes us stupider. So I don't expect people to, to know this. So it's not like we're calling them out and calling them stupid or ignorant. We're just pointing out that a lot of people don't realize this. You do a look, get a map out. Okay. So Russia is, it's heart of Eurasia, right? It's the center of the Eurasian world island. So you have Russia. Now, right next to Russia, you have Ukraine. And the USA has overthrown the government of Ukraine in 2014, and they've been arming neo-Nazis and extremists in Ukraine, the Azov Battalion, these forces that are very anti-Russian in Ukraine. And then take a look at your map, right next to Russia, you got Ukraine. Now look next to your map at Belarus. Belarus is right there on the map as well, right there next to Russia. And in Belarus, they had an election, and the very popular president, Alexander Lukashenko, won. And so the USA had all their allies in Belarus go around and burn things and blow things up, and there was unrest and chaos in the streets of Belarus. And now Kazakhstan, again, look at your map, look at Kazakhstan, right? Now Kazakhstan, again, the price of natural gas went up. The government deregulated the price of natural gas, which was a really bad decision, in my opinion. And the people went out and protested. And then the United States called up all of its allies and had them go out and do stuff. And guns were being distributed on the streets. And terrorists from other countries were coming in there. And the country was up in flames. Now look at Russia on the map. Ukraine, their neighbor, USA is tearing it up. Belarus, their neighbor, USA is tearing it up. Kazakhstan, their neighbor, the USA is tearing it up. Which country is the aggressor here? Right? I don't see Russia overthrowing the government of Mexico and causing riots in Mexico. I don't see Russia, trying to cause instability in Canada. So how in the world is anyone going to tell us that Russia is the aggressor here? It's pretty clear the United States is causing instability all around Russia. Meanwhile, in Russia itself, the USA has been funding and promoting this guy named Alexei Navalny, who has been causing instability and causing unrest. He can't run for president because he's been convicted of a crime. And so even though he can't run, somehow he claims he's being persecuted. It's rigged against him because he's not allowed to run. So all of his followers go out there and cause instability. It's looking pretty clear to me that the United States is the one going after Russia here, whereas Russia wants to have better relations with the United States. Russia wants to, sell oil and natural gas on the international markets just like any other country does. So it is beyond me the way U.S. media talks about it. I mean, it's like they have it completely backwards. And now we're all supposed to be holding our breath for this horrendous Russian false flag that's about to happen. Give me a break. I mean, I'm sure you got plenty to say there, Daniel. Go ahead.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And the obvious point for anyone who actually follows international media, if you read the Global Times, if you read, other newspapers across the world, is that actually everyone else knows that too. The kind of situation that people in the United States or in parts of Europe are in, this incredible bubble of mind control media. Just like completely lying, fraudulent, intelligence operative, infested media is it's really very dangerous, I think, because there's what I see is that there's this tremendous potential, because actually, take up the question of Kazakhstan. People probably know, at least to some extent at this point, that this is like absolutely crucial nation in the development of Eurasia, the Eurasian integration, the Belt and Road Initiative. It is the largest dry port in the world, and something like 4,000, enormous numbers of rail, freight rail goes through there. Tons of freight rail go through there every single day, all the way to Europe, of course. The very fact that exists, the very fact that the U.S. that the China-Russia strategic partnership exists, has to do with outflanking of the Anglo-American empire of the City of London and Wall Street that happened 20 years ago. And that's really sort of what we're dealing with. I have this remarkable document by Lyndon LaRouche from 1996 where he talks about getting rid of NATO.
Mhm.
And he says, what we need to do is to eliminate NATO and focus on the development of the Eurasian land bridge. Because it was back in 96 that was first being promoted by the LaRouche movement as the policy to defeat the financier oligarchy. And that's sort of the context that I would look at it from today, that basically people are noticing that the color revolutions are failing. People are noticing that, for example, Putin was the one who intervened in Syria after being invited in, and now Assad is still there. The Syrian people have been under massive damage. The Caesar sanctions have been absolutely horrendous and evil, killing large numbers of people, and yet they're still there. And now they just joined the Belt and Road Initiative officially. So there's this change that's happening in the world. And what I see is that the kind of hypocrisy that you're talking about, this just absolutely evil, disgusting hypocrisy of the American political class, is blocking out what really exists in potential, which is an extremely inspiring situation in the development of a new paradigm, the relationship between Russia, China, Iran is coming into this through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And people should get excited about the potential to change the conditions of the world. But if we're going to do that, we have to also admit that the fact that our nation is being run by lunatics is actually gravely threatening the existence of the human species.
Oh, absolutely. It's so funny. Everyone's a Nazi nowadays. I mean, everybody, right? I mean, the January 6th, those people that were running around the Capitol,
Yeah.
Nazis, right? Isn't that what Hitler used to do? He used to go into government buildings with buffalo horns on and run around crazy. That was I think he did that 2 or 3 times in his life. But anyway, January 6th, Nazis. Trump, Nazi, right? Dissident leftists. If you're a leftist and you don't agree with the mainstream of the left, you're a Nazi. But there are actual Nazis in Ukraine who admire an actual Hitler collaborator named Stepan Bandera.
Yep.
Had this actual Nazi battalion called the Azov Battalion that's part of the Ukrainian government, and no one notices it. It's really weird. We're seeing Nazis everywhere except where they actually exist. These people are tearing down World War II memorials. Right now in the USA, it's trendy to tear down Confederate memorials.
Yep.
These people are tearing down monuments to World War II. You can't get more Nazi than that, right? So I mean, it's shocking to me that people aren't noticing this. But this fits a whole trend of NATO, right? When NATO was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, there were a lot of former Nazis who were involved in it, right?
Absolutely.
CIA went over to Germany and recruited a lot of Nazis and got them involved in their anti-communist efforts. And that NATO has always been an imperialist coalition, right? It has always been, some people call it the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization, right? Because, it was NATO that bombed and destroyed Libya and reduced Libya to poverty. Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent under the leadership of Gaddafi and Islamic socialism. Now people are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out. It was NATO that destroyed Yugoslavia and took Yugoslavia and ripped it to shreds, and then ended up bombing Serbia and killing people there. And the crimes of NATO are massive. And I mean, the whole purpose of NATO was basically, after the Second World War, the communists had been anti-fascists. They had fought against Hitler, and in France they'd formed the underground resistance, and in Italy they'd formed the partisan brigades that went out and fought the fascists. And the communists had built the anti-fascist Popular Front before the Second World War and supported Roosevelt, and etc. And so after World War II, it looked like the communists were going to win the elections. And in France, the Communist Party did very well. In Italy, the Communist Party did very well. And so NATO was formed to make sure that socialism did not expand into Western Europe. It was a block that was formed basically to make sure that you never saw the expansion. But it gets a little deeper than just socialism and capitalism, though, because many people have pointed out the greatest fear of the British has always been the Germans and the Russians together. That if the Germans and the Russians ever get together, that means the ability of the British to dominate the European mainland is basically nil. It's overruled. And that's why they are so determined to make sure that Western Europe, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, Germany, that they never get friendly to Russia. They always want to have that divide, right? That they always want to have an Anglosphere in Western Europe. And that in many ways, Western Europe feels kind of colonized. There's resentment in Western Europe to the way the British have treated them. Great example is the issue of nuclear power, right? I mean, the French love nuclear power. The Germans love nuclear power. And the reason that they love nuclear power is because they don't like being dependent on oil from the British, right? The British dominate the oil markets, the British and the Americans do. But the French, that's why they've invested so much money in nuclear energy, is that they want to be independent. The founder of the nuclear energy program of France was a Communist Party member and a physicist, right? And the idea was that France should be able to have its own electricity. We don't need the British oil and the British natural gas. We can run that. And it's the United States has worked really, really hard against nuclear power and against nuclear energy. And the British also, they don't like nuclear energy because they want the world to be dependent on them. And that there are many examples of this. I mean, there's this Nord Stream 2 pipeline that's been constructed. It's been finished. It is a pipeline from Russia to Germany. That is a natural gas pipeline, so the Germans can buy natural gas from Russia. And the USA did everything they could to try and kill this pipeline. They put sanctions on people, but it got built. The natural gas pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is built. But now the new government in Germany, Angela Merkel's out. They've got a new government there, won't turn it on. And they won't turn it on at a time that the price of natural gas is through the roof. I mean, in Europe, they're having an especially cold winter, high demand for natural gas, supply chain issues. And they've got this pipeline, this huge pipeline built from Russia. Russia's ready to start pumping natural gas in there and save the day, but oh no, they won't turn it on. And so the price of natural gas is through the roof. And somehow they're telling us this is Russia's fault, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's Russia's ready to start pumping more natural gas onto the international markets. It's the Germans that won't turn the pipeline on, and it's the Americans and the British that don't want them to. So this is outrageous. And if I were a German, if I were a French person, I would be mad about this. I'd be like, what do I get from our alliance with the British? These sanctions that they put on Russia. There's a lot of dock workers in Germany who lost their jobs because shipping. Those ports are very important to Germany. And a lot of dock workers lost their jobs because the shipping activity on those ports in Germany vastly decreased when sanctions were put on Russia, and the NATO countries had to cooperate with it. Europe gains nothing from going along with the British and the Americans' moves against the Russians. They don't. They just don't. Am I wrong?
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt had in the book, as he saw it by his son Elliot Roosevelt, is really develops clearly. He says the colonial system means war. Exploit the resources of an India, a Burma, a Java, take all the wealth out of these countries, but never put anything back into them. Things like education, decent standards of living, minimum health requirements. All you're doing is storing up the kinds of trouble that leads to war. He said, and he talks about what should be done for India at the time. He says, as a commonwealth, India would be entitled to a modern form of government, an adequate health and educational standard. But how can she have these things when Britain is taking all the wealth of her natural resources away from her every year? Every year, the Indian people have one thing to look forward to, like death and taxes. Sure as shooting, they have a famine, the season of a famine. I mean, these are words from 1943, if I remember correctly. But that's absolutely what's happening today. There are these, you have a condition in the world where the underdeveloped regions of the world are being kept underdeveloped by a system of global free trade that is run by the City of London and Wall Street. And those entities, which are really effectively, they're supranational, they're imperial from that standpoint, they are committed to a certain outlook about man and about the strategic situation, that their expectations for the world. And it's my view that that's really clearly this Malthusian belief about the nature of man. Because if you believe in the idea of oligarchism, then what you're saying is that some people are born as masters and some people are born as slaves, and that's just how it is. That's just how the world works, man. And if you believe that, then you must continually cause people, induce societies to accept the belief in zero growth and in reducing consumption, or even reducing the human population, which of course is a stated goal of the British monarchy, of various, climate scientists like Schellenhuber, who's the leading advisor to Merkel when she made a lot of the decisions to cancel nuclear and so forth. He was someone who said, thank God we figured out something, which is that the world can only handle 500 million people. So at least now we know that there's a carrying capacity and we can deal with that. Right? So they have a belief about this. Another thing, a way to really communicate what I'm talking about is if you look at what Obama said, I think it's 2009 in Johannesburg, but I forget exactly when. He says, if everyone in Africa had, air conditioning and a big house and car, then the whole world would boil over, unless we had new forms of energy. So by his statement, he's saying that if you have a form of energy that doesn't produce CO2, then you could use that and we can actually provide for the development of the world. And everyone knows that exists. So besides the question of CO2, the issue is it's an overt policy, knowing full well that it's not necessary, that this is not something that needs to happen. They're enforcing it because of a belief that that's necessary for their system. And
Sure. Well, Daniel, that's an interesting thing. I wrote this book called Bread Tube Serves Imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I pointed out in it is that Marx was not, let me emphasize this, not a Malthusian,
Mm-hmm.
right? Marxism is all about growth and development. Marxism puts forward the notion that the problem with capitalism is that under capitalism, technological progress leads to poverty. Under capitalism, the more efficient the production process becomes, the fewer people that get hired to work in it. And as a result, those workers cannot buy back the products that are being produced, and you have a glut. And that the point of socialism is to resolve the problem of technology creating poverty and poverty amid abundance by having a rationally planned economy so that growth can be unlimited. And that the ultimate goal of communism, of a stateless, classless world, is only possible with a huge advance in technology and a huge expansion of production so that there's so much abundance in society that inequality can break down. But what these bread tubers believe is that the opposite. They think the problem with capitalism is that it creates growth. Well, I'm sorry, look at the world. 200, 300 years, there's still people dying of starvation. Capitalism clearly doesn't create growth, right? I mean, it hasn't wiped out poverty. The problem with capitalism is that it holds back growth, right? And the notion that growth is bad and that there are too many people in the world, we need to reduce consumption, has absolutely nothing to do with the teachings of Karl Marx. Has nothing to do with it. You will not find that anywhere in Marx's writings. You might talk about the need to be more long-term and strategic in how you deal with natural resources. He might talk about how human beings change the way they interact with their environment. But at no point does Karl Marx ever say his goal is to make people poorer, is to reduce consumption, or stop growth. But that is the central thesis of the bread tubers.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, you may not know this, but this movie, Don't Look Up, this film they just made, right?
Mm-hmm.
The author of it is a bread tuber, a guy named David Sirota. David Sirota, and he's one of these Jacobin creeps.
Yeah.
He wrote this movie, Don't Look Up,
Yeah.
which is basically using like an asteroid hitting the Earth as an analogy for climate change, and saying that basically, human beings, we're all so, crazy and caught up in growth. At one point, the climax of the film, I don't know if you watched Don't Look Up. Did you watch Don't Look Up, Daniel?
No, but I read about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all over the place because, look, strategic defense of Earth, right? I mean, we do need to deal with things like, meteorites.
Yeah.
The actual issue that the film is about is a legit concern, right?
Yeah.
Deal with that, right? But they're using it as an analogy for climate change, as an analogy for Donald Trump. And, the climax of the film, they're having like competing rallies across the United States because this meteorite is coming. And the people that want to stop the meteorite are are chanting, just look up. And then Meryl Streep, who's playing the president, is telling them, don't look up. And she's saying, don't look up, because the people who want you to look up, they want you to be pessimistic. They don't believe in growth. They don't believe in jobs. They don't believe in tomorrow. And they're basically equating believing in economic growth with, wanting to end the planet. And that's what David Sirota was getting at. He doesn't believe in growth. And if you watch the film, I mean, it's very, very pessimistic, very, very pessimistic, and dark. And again, it's an attack on human progress, right? And I mean, the idea that human progress would prevent us from stopping a comet that's hitting the Earth is ridiculous. I mean, the space.
How else are we going to do it?
Yeah, the space program, that would be a moment where we'd need lots of human creativity and lots of growth and lots of innovation. So the whole analogy is just off in so many ways, but really underlying it is the message that human beings are animals, that deep down we are the problem. The problem is us. The problem is humans. We're just flawed, and that's the problem. And that is what these folks believe. That's what the Malthusians have always believed. That's what the British Empire has always promoted.
Absolutely.
That's what the imperialists believe. And they have a negative view of human beings. And this movie, Don't Look Up, I mean, you couldn't miss it. You know what I mean? It was it was like Facebook. I'm like, what is Don't Look Up? But it was like everywhere. I kept hearing about it, and my wife and I, we finally thought, okay, we might as well just sit down and watch it. And then I regretted it. It was like one of those bad songs you can't get out of your head. You know what I'm saying? For the next 2 or 3 days, I was just like, can I take this out of my mind? Right? It was just, it wouldn't go away. It was like a brain worm. And it held my attention. It was funny. It was kind of comedic, and it held my attention throughout it. But at the end of the day, it was a toxic anti-human message. And that's what a lot of social media is putting out. A lot of mainstream media is putting out. That's what a lot of our educational system is putting out right now. We are being taught to have contempt for our own species. Would you not agree? You seem to be muted, Daniel.
I think I told this story before, because I totally agree with you, but I'm going to tell it again very briefly and then try to address what you're saying. Sure. I started working with the LaRouche movement and the Schiller Institute because I was reading all of everything that we were putting out that was indicating that the core issue is what you're talking about. And I thought, that's over the top. And then I was a school teacher in Harlem, and I was teaching science to fifth graders, and I was given a lesson plan book from the teacher who was training me. I was a young teacher at the time. I was like 25. And I was told, use this one. And I picked up one, and it was an exercise where you put things on the wall, agree, disagree, strongly agree. And you ask the kids a series of questions. And the final question is 7 billion people too much? And who wrote this? The World Wildlife Fund, financed and organized by the late Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who were Nazis. In fact, Prince Philip had 2 sisters who married SS officers, and Prince Bernhard signed his resignation from the Nazi Party, Heil Hitler. So these are people, it's not even, Hitler was part of their own creation, so that's not exactly the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that this anti-human policy is massively increased in terms of the cultural degradation of the United States over the past 20 years, in my view. I think that, it's something that you and I saw when we were growing up, but now it's like everywhere. And as you say, it's being promulgated by BreadTube, which is also financed by the British monarchy, and through Netflix, the Obama operation. Everywhere, everything you see is just this horrible no hope, no future. Squid Game is the same thing. And the whole mode is designed to induce pessimism. So I think this raises a number of major questions. And one of them is, something I became very much an adherent of, which is the idea that you need a renaissance of the most beautiful ideas and culture and art and music in the history of mankind. And that this is not anything in the mode that we've seen in the 20th century. The 20th century largely, was a catastrophe. And it's been a disaster. Forget it. Go to Brahms, go to Mozart, go to Beethoven, go to Schubert, and listen to that. And what comes across is agape, in the sense used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, in the sense used by Plato: love of justice, love of truth, love of mankind, love of God. That there's something that we can positively express about the nature of the human individual and the nature of humanity that mankind desperately needs right now, because it's so clear that the West, as such, is completely, perverted in that sense of things because of this constant encouragement of the idea that man is an animal. And the whole method of cultural programming has much less to do with the message than people think. Although it's totally true what you're saying, the message is absolutely there explicitly, but it has to do with a essential sort of mission that the oligarchy has, which is to drive people into their senses, to bring them out of the realm of ideas, to get them into just a mode where, you can't let go of the phone. You just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. You see one little image of something really cute, and then the next image, the next video is someone getting punched in the face terribly, or something like that, some horrible vignette of violence. And that is, it's Tavistock. It's an intentional policy of breaking down the social ability of human beings to relate to each other and express a certain hope and desire for the future. And we should here's my view. I think that we've reached such a breaking point on this that it's actually the people, who are watching your streams, who are associated with the CPI, and many other people in sort of concentric circles all around, people who are working with the Schiller Institute, who have a hunger for the optimism that you see in China. Everyone knows that in China, the children want to be astronauts, and in the United States, people want to be YouTubers, right? I mean, here we are on YouTube, but that's what they want, right? And that's the thing that we should be investigating further and further. How is it that the Chinese managed to develop a advanced culture that is really, the president of China is committed to the idea that education is about improving the character of the individual, is about making a more beautiful character. He's made speeches about this to leading academics, and China has committed an enormous share of its budget to cultural development of its youth. So these are some of the things I think we got to be thinking about.
Yeah, well, I wanted to read you something, because read our audience something. Eugene Debs, who was the great socialist leader in the early part of the 20th century, who went to prison for speaking against World War I. He gave a speech in Canton, Ohio. That's what they ultimately put him in prison for, was this very long anti-war speech he gave. And there's one particular passage from it that people don't often read. People remember the part he said about, the rich people start the wars and the working class people fight in them and stuff. This is this is like 2 paragraphs from that speech. I'll just read to you right now. He says, "You need to know that it is your duty to rise above the animal plane of existence. You need to know that it is for you to know something about literature and science and art. You need to know that you are verging on the edge of a great new world. You need to get in touch with your comrades and fellow workers, and to become conscious of your interests, your powers, and your possibilities as a class. You need to know that you are the great majority of mankind. You need to know that as long as you are ignorant, as long as you are indifferent, as long as you are apathetic, unorganized, and content, you will remain exactly where you are. You will be exploited, you will be degraded, and you will have to beg for a job. You will just get enough for your slavish toil to keep you working in order, and you will be looked down upon with scorn and contempt by the very parasites that live and luxuriate of your sweat and unpaid labor. If you would be respected, you've got to begin by respecting yourself. Stand up squarely and look yourself in the face and see a man. Do not allow yourself to fall into the predicament of the poor fellow who, after he had heard a socialist speech, concluded that he ought to be a socialist. The argument that he heard was unanswerable. Yes, he said to himself, all the speaker said was true, and I ought to join the party. But after a while, he allowed his ardor to cool, and he soberly concluded that by joining the party, he might anger his boss and lose his job. And then he concluded, I can't take that chance. That night, he slept alone, and there was something on his conscience, and it resulted in a dreadful dream. Men always have such dreadful dreams when they betray themselves. But a socialist is free to go to bed with a clear conscience. He goes to sleep with his manhood, and he awakens and walks forth in the morning with self-respect. He is unafraid, and he can look the whole world in the face without a tremor or a blush. What do you think of that, Daniel?
I think it's the spirit that we need today. I really do. I mean, I want to take that spirit and follow that thread as it is expressed in another American hero, Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
You know, and pursue ever more the sense that this is our destiny as Americans, as human beings, people across the world, to reach a level of relationship to one another that truly regards the other as a human being. I mean, that's the basic principle for solving the crisis between NATO and Russia. You have to have the idea in the negotiations that the interest of the other is your own interest, which is that's the fundamental way that we're going to rise above the standard of an animal, is through this form of love.
So we have our first super chat question here. They say the elites are apparently trying to make the masses happy with less and less, typing this while listening to Brahms' 4 symphonies. What do you say to that, Daniel?
I love it. And I think about Brahms' 4 serious songs, which are about, they communicate the idea that there is something that goes beyond our own deaths, that as a human being you can contribute in a way that is immortal, that has to do with the nature of the universe, making an advancement for all of humanity. I think my personal view, my present commitment, my present devotion is to the idea that there is one major pivot point that we could use to change the condition that we're talking about. And that is Afghanistan. Huge news over the past 48 hours that the UN head Guterres has called for the United States to unfreeze the assets of the Afghan central bank, which, just to put it in brief context for people, 5% of the entire population of 38 million have enough to eat. 23 million people are in various degrees of extreme hunger. And of those, 8.9 million people are at the starvation point.
Wow.
I really encourage people to educate themselves on this situation.
Sure. Well, before we get to this next super chat question, I just wanted to react to what you're saying, because right now in Afghanistan, they're having a famine, right? 20 years of U.S. occupation and instability has left them in just dire desperation, right? And then the USA has now pulled out, but it's frozen all of their assets, and all of their government money is frozen. They don't have access to it. And people are dying. I mean, there's a crisis of malnutrition. And since this pandemic began, there has been a huge increase in malnutrition in Africa, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Where is the media on this, right? Because remember when Venezuela was having food issues? All over. See, socialism causes people to be hungry. Socialism, but all over the world, capitalism and its mismanagement of this pandemic has killed people through malnutrition in Afghanistan, in Africa, in Asian countries, in South American countries, and nothing is being said about it, right? And this is a man-made famine. One of our good comrades, Lily, she went to the anti-lockdown demonstration they had today in Boston, and she interviewed people. And we had to edit that. I posted the video of it earlier. We had to edit out a lot of what they said because I don't want to put any scientific disinformation out there, right? And that some of what these people say about science, but underneath it was frustration with how the economy of the United States is just being demolished, right? It's just being completely demolished by these lockdowns. And we have the highest COVID death rates in the world, practically. I mean, we've been managing this COVID crisis worse than any other country, but there's just more lockdowns. There's talk of now a fourth vaccine. In Israel, they're talking about a fourth vaccine. And this is capitalism in crisis, and it seems like it's not being discussed. Do you want to say anything about that before we get to our super chat?
People are trying. The policy of the oligarchy is to induce people to believe that mass death is simply a way of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a feature of modern life. And they're trying to inure people to that situation while still going forward, as you highlighted, with this incredible hypocrisy about the, advantages of liberal democracy. I mean, we're really reaching into a new kind of evil because we're talking about $9.5 billion frozen from the Afghan central bank, held in U.S. banks because of the U.S. Treasury order from the Biden administration, and there's more in Germany at Commerzbank, and we're talking about genocide with the stroke of a pen. We've had sanctions before. We've had vicious, mass murderous sanctions. Everyone knows that. That's been an incredibly evil policy that has been executed by our government, by many governments in the West for a long time now. But now we're talking about 9 million people going to starve to death in Afghanistan, the nation where we were killing 250 people were dying per day because of the war. And now we're gonna murder 9 million people by crushing their economy. There's actually not a lack of food, but there's no money. There's no possibility of dealing with this. Guterres addresses that in his message, and he successfully got Blinken to talk on the phone, or whoever is working with Guterres. They pressured Blinken to talk on the phone with people at the UN who are focused on Afghanistan. We don't have any result yet, but what I'm saying is that if we could move now, if we could successfully unfreeze the assets, it would be such a victory against a Nazi-style genocide. And it could be the beginning. It should only be done from the standpoint of the full economic development of Afghanistan, which should involve the United States, Russia, China, and India. If you could get the big powers in there, because who could say that it's against the interests of any of those nations for Afghanistan to have clean water, food, medical system? Who could say that? And if you could get that change to happen right there, and then Afghanistan would be part of the Belt and Road system, then we might be able to fundamentally shift the West off of this policy of destruction and war.
All right, so here's another super chat question, and keep them rolling in, folks. We're here to answer your questions. Daniel and I, it's Saturday night. We're here, and we're here to talk to you. So this question is, didn't LaRouche abandon socialism and histomat, though? Well, I would reply to the person by saying, and didn't most of the mainstream left completely abandon the working class, though? I mean, but go on, right? I mean, I'm not a follower of Lyndon LaRouche. I agree with a lot of what he had to say, but some of the things I don't agree with. But you are part of that organization, so I'll let you answer that, Daniel.
Well, LaRouche died in 2019. I'm really extremely fortunate that I got a chance to meet with him a few times and talk to him and be a member of his organization when he was alive. And I would just say that read him. And don't just read stuff from 1975, although I'm not against that. I love it. It's wonderful. Read the material from when the organization was talking about, Rosa Luxemburg was talking about socialism very clearly and so forth. I don't think that any of that needs to be sort of rejected or act as though it doesn't exist. Of course not. But read what happened in the 1970s, in the late 1970s into the 80s, and read what happened afterwards. Because it's not what LaRouche was seeking unto, like his view of his own discovery. You can read a beautiful paper he wrote called On LaRouche's Discovery that he wrote while he was in prison in 93. But he talks about how his core insight was on his discovery has to do with the relationship between the breakthroughs in fundamental science that are made by an individual human mind in discovering universal physical principle, as in the example of Johannes Kepler, for example, or Einstein discovering the equals mc squared, or you know what I mean. That kind of breakthrough is, how do you measure that in terms of the effect on an economy? That's his view of what his subject is. Is what is the effect of individual human creativity on the productivity of the species as a whole, on the advancement of the species as a whole? And in that, he wrote throughout his life that he was consistent from the outset. So when he was doing that from the standpoint of investigating Marxian economics, he did it. And in the late 1970s, they began to discuss Henry Carey, Alexander Hamilton, and the American system, which, if you haven't read them, I would just pose to you, why not? Because, I mean, those are American economists who are not allowed in the neoliberal classroom. I took the economics course at Harvard. They didn't teach Hamilton. They don't do that. It's not allowed. So you might ask yourself, what is it that was in there that he chose to adopt? But it's up to you how you choose to proceed.
Well, I have quoted Henry Carey before when I'm explaining Lenin's concept of imperialism. I think that quote where he talks about the American system versus the British system, or the English system, I think is what he calls it.
British.
He talks about where it's like slavery was about holding back industrial development, and he talks about the British policies in India. And I think I see some overlap between that and Lenin's theory of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Marx, unfortunately, Marx did support free trade. Marx had it in his mind that free trade would expand capitalism all over the world, and that would lay the basis for a working class and a proletariat all over the world, which would eventually have socialism. And that free trade would bring working people around the world together. It would break down national barriers. But if you get to about 1880, 1890, it became pretty clear that's not what was happening. It was the opposite. It was that the free trade, Adam Smith global economic system was preventing economic development, especially in places like India and Africa and elsewhere. And that's when Lenin writes, and a couple of years later, he writes his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, basically arguing that capitalism in its monopoly stage was holding back economic development around the world, and that nationalism among colonized people might be a good thing because they're fighting to break free from that domination, that foreign domination. And that Marx had said all nationalism is reactionary. But even in the final years of his life, Marx became a big supporter of the Irish people in their struggle for national liberation because he realized that, that the struggle against capitalism in Britain was intrinsically tied up with the Irish people and their national liberation struggle. And that Karl Marx's daughter even started wearing a crucifix around her neck because the Irish people were fighting for their independence on the basis of being Catholic. And so she started wearing a crucifix around her neck. She was, from a Jewish family and atheist, but she wore a crucifix to make the point that she stood with the Irish people against the British. So that is, there's some overlap there. And I think it's important to talk about. And that you'll notice what a lot of these bread tubers do is they just go back to workers versus employers. That's all they get out of Marx. Is that some people own the factory, some people work in the factory. That's not fair. So shouldn't we start a worker cooperative where everyone owns it equally? Well, worker cooperatives are good, but they're still operating according to profit. So it's not socialism, right? It's still a profit-centered economic system. And you're not getting to the essence of what Marx taught, which is historical progress and development. And then you're not getting to the brilliance of Lenin, showing that modern global capitalism doesn't create that. So yeah, I mean, I've quoted Henry Carey before, and I encourage people to look into that stuff. I think there's a lot that can be learned from it. And Hamilton, I will say, Christian Parenti has written this book, Radical Hamilton. And that is a real switch, even when I was first getting into Marxism, 15, 20 years ago, people were still promoting the idea of Jefferson as the great revolutionary, and they would talk of the Hamiltonian counter-revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really Christian Parenti, probably responding to the work, the efforts, the relentless efforts of your organization, who's kind of brought back. And now in left-wing circles, Hamilton is respected. So I think that's a great breakthrough.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say that if you go to Hamilton directly, then you can get past some of the other failures in forecasting. I appreciate what you're referring to in a certain sense here. You can judge whether someone is right based on whether their ideas are, bear out over time, right? Whether they actually accurately forecast what's going to happen in the future, and they know how to do about it. Not just the prediction that says, well, there's a 15% chance that the world's going to blow up, but actually says, here's what we can do. Here's what ideas will function, because this is how the world actually works. This is how the universe works. And if you look at Hamilton was at war with Adam Smith. That's what his whole thing was. That's what his whole fight was to provide the basis for a sovereign republic. You cannot have a sovereign republic if you do not have a national banking system that's organized in order to extend real credit to increases in the platform of your economy, the physical platform, the physical economy. If we didn't have that image, which you understand in Hamilton, because he talks about the idea that increases in productivity come from the human mind. So if you understand that, then, like Hamilton, you will fight for the abolition of slavery, and you will fight, well, for let me be clear, he was against slavery, he was committed to eliminating it, and he was the founder, one of the key founders of the Manumission Society, the first one in New York. But you will fight for that, and you will fight for universal education of every person in your republic, because you understand that the wealth is the human mind. The wealth is the creative power of the human mind. And actually, that the purpose of increasing your economic capability, your productivity, is so that you can go back to the human beings in your system and give them an ability to be even more mature in their creative potential.
All right. So we now have another super chat question. And we got two, actually. So there's one after this. But Heavy Dukes is asking, what is LaRouche's view of the neocons?
Okay, let me get some from my... Here we go. Now, surely you know about this book.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, you can see how old it is.
You must be anti-Semitic, because anyone who uses the word Satan is anti-Semitic, I've been told. Anyone who uses the word Satan is anti-Semitic, I've been told. So therefore, that must have been what he was saying.
That's incredible. I can't believe that anyone would say that. Well, only people who don't want you to understand Satan would say that. Right. This is when we were fighting to remove Dick Cheney. Of course, LaRouche PAC is defunct. There's more to say on that, but I won't at the moment. Don't go. It's nothing. But the original.
Tell us about neocons.
Yeah. I mean, the neocons. Everyone knows that they're Trotskyists, right? That's what they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, I would just say that they introduced this period that we're in. They introduced this process that we're in, which is the total breakdown of relations between countries, between nations, between major nations. They introduced that, in a major way, and they did it with Tony Blair. If you look at 1999, University of Chicago, Tony Blair gives a huge speech where he says we've got to see the end of the Westphalian system of sovereign nation states. He's referring to the Treaty of Westphalia, which was the end of the 30 Years' War, And Helga Zeppler-Rouch has repeatedly said in the past days, I was listening to her today, that the only way to address the NATO-Russia crisis today is this principle of Westphalia, which is, again, the idea of the interest of the other. That if we continue this war, then no one's going to live, no one's going to survive, no one's going to win. So therefore, we have to reorganize our approach to each other. The neocons were completely involved in this, and we did a major piece. LaRouche did a major piece attacking them for their relationship to Leo Strauss, which is critical because you can see today. I mean, I was trying to understand what's going on in the right wing, because there are some people that seem to be at least possible to talk to about things like war with Russia. And there are some, I don't mean to say there are not, but there are plenty. But if you look at the role of those continuing networks of Leo Strauss on the West Coast and on the East Coast, these people really believe in the idea of the noble lie. They really think, like Cheney, that we know better than everyone else, and I do it again in a minute. I do it like that kind of evil and heinous. I don't mean to go on, but that kind of arrogance, we see that today. It introduced Obama, right? I mean, we wouldn't have Obama if it weren't for the neocons, and Obama took that to the next level.
Sure. Well, I mean, Irving Kristol, who was a Trotskyite, who turned against the Soviet Union, he became the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program of the CIA, funneling money to fake leftists. He is considered the father of neoconservatism, as is this guy you mentioned, Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss, he wrote this book called Art. I read it, The Persecution and the Art of Writing. And he basically argues that that philosophy throughout history is written in code. Because the philosophers are all just so much smarter than everybody else. And that throughout history, philosophers, the philosopher kings, like in Plato, are persecuted by the rabble, by the people. And that freedom is necessary so the philosophers can rule and do their great work. And so the philosophers need to kind of get together and lie to everybody and manipulate everyone so that no one gets together and ruins their freedom and prevents them from ruling over everybody else like they should, because they're the superior ones. It is an elitist philosophy in its essence. And the trajectory, the history of Trotskyism to neoconservatism. I mean, it's like the Trotskyites, these are the ones who sold out the Soviet Union because it wasn't the liberal paradise they wanted. They held on to like the Eurocentric belief that only Western Europe could have socialism. That socialism in Russia or China or Vietnam didn't matter. There's that element of continuity. And they were leftists who were more concerned about, nonconformity and intellectual freedom than they were about like the economics of socialism. And got in with the CIA. The CIA, that's a really big part of that. Irving Kristol and the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And they largely reinvented U.S. politics. They reinvented this brand of conservatism, which was really popular. It's dead now. You don't see it as much. But when Fox News was really strong during the Bush years, it was this kind of like, my country, right or wrong. If you don't like it here, move to another country. That's what the neocons are famous for, that kind of dumb conservative politics. That was really, I mean, it started out with the liberals. Like the liberals had kind of dumbed down politics with the new left and rock and roll and TV. And so it was like, how was the right going to gain any ground? Okay, they had to like reinvent conservatism, to be kind of dumber and to serve the society. The other thing is that the neocons had a very close alliance with the evangelical Christian right and the mega churches, where they play the rock music and everyone cries and screams. It's very, very emotional Christianity that's not really big on like what Jesus actually taught or the Bible. It's just kind of about crying and having a big emotional experience. That was a big part of the neocons also, I think. But it was a shift in U.S. politics. And it flows from this elitism. I think that's what you're getting at, and that's what that book you held up gets at.
No,
right?
no, I agree with you completely. I mean, famously, Strauss says that Plato was actually lying to most of the people he was talking to, and he was keeping his secret ideology apart. And then he practices that. Of course, Strauss only claims that so he can practice it. People should actually read Plato.
Yeah. So John McCarthy says it's great to see this kind of collaboration between organizations and that while they may disagree on many things, agree on some of the most important issues like this century, war, peace, diplomacy, and anti-imperialism. What do you say to that, Daniel?
I say thank you, John. I'm so glad that you're supporting this. I agree with you. I think, I mean, we should have. We're really close to war, and we have to wake the American people up. Everyone who sees this, everyone who has goodwill, has to wake people up. And I think I'm going to reiterate again and again: work towards this question of unfreezing the assets of Afghanistan and seeing the economic development. Helga LaRouche has been saying we need something called Operation Ibn Sina, which is a reference to the great mind of the Islamic Renaissance, Ibn Sina, known in the West largely as Avicenna, who is really, I mean, incredibly important in the history of medical science. Ibn Sina, he lived around 1000 AD, and he lived in, at that time, Persia. And he was the one who figured out quarantine. He actually figured out how to stop infectious diseases. And many other things like that. He actually took medicine out of superstition and into the realm of science. And what she's saying is, take this guy as an image, his ideas as the power to begin medical system in Afghanistan that they need. There's crisis of incredibly happening there.
All right. So Jonah says, when we spoke earlier, Daniel mentioned he had trouble making inroads with conservatives during Trump. What were the biggest takeaways from these efforts, and what do you two think are the best strategies for moving forward? That's very, very interesting. So Daniel, you did far more engaging with Trump supporters than I did. So why don't you go ahead?
So, I went to at least 4 Trump rallies, maybe 5. In fact, the biggest thing I did in my campaign for U.S. Senate was I went to the only Trump rally in New Jersey. I mean, I don't mean the biggest thing, but that's when we had the most volunteers. We had a large presence there. And we said to them, you have to work with us to stop the hate campaign against China, to work with China, to join the Belt and Road Initiative. And you have to work with us to stop Russiagate, because this is part of the setup for the increased collapse of relations between U.S. and Russia. And it was really difficult. I have to say, it was really difficult. I met a lot of good people, but what you see is the operation of Steve Bannon in particular, who is very much associated with the worst European oligarchs. The operation of Steve Bannon and his associates, and his associates like the Falun Gong and their whole operation, and Miles Kwok and so forth. That is one of the most dangerous movements. I don't know, sort of phenomena that I think has happened. If you look at someone like Jack Posobiec, I think that these people are extraordinarily dangerous because they have such a grip on people. And you saw, I found it very difficult to help people to get a broader view. It's not that we didn't succeed in some cases, but it says to me that people who sort of are are thinking about how to deal with these problems have to target specifically people like Bannon and figure out who he is, figure out what's behind him, figure out how they're doing this operation. Think about it. What happened is that all of my Trump contacts, I don't mean Trump like in the Trump organization or campaign, I mean Trump supporters, all of my friends who are Trump supporters, they got brainwashed on China by War Room Pandemic. They got really brainwashed. And it was very challenging to see. I had lots of fights with them, but they didn't make it out in large part. They really are still sort of stuck in that network.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You mentioned Jack Posobiec, right? How do you say his name?
I think his name is pronounced Posobiec, but Poso.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because, Jordan Peterson is also really big among conservatives now.
Yeah.
And that man will say things that are just not true. I did a video response to him recently, and I plan to do some more. But, he said in a video, for example, that Hitler was elected by a huge majority. And he's using that to make the point that, the problem isn't Hitler, it's just the evil within all of us. We all have evil deep down. Hitler was never elected by a huge majority. That didn't happen. And he
Mm-mm.
says it with just such confidence. A huge majority. No one had ever seen such a big majority. Didn't happen. Didn't
Mhm.
happen. But he thinks it's such a brilliant way to make this point that deep down we're evil. And he likes to go on about communism and fascism and how they all bring out the worst. And you're more evil than you really think you are. You have evil within yourself. I mean, it's like he has just got, I mean, his whole thing is ragging on human beings, right? It's supposed to be this self-help kind of thing, but at the end of the day, it's just this idea that human beings are rotten and dirty and no good, and that some, and then defense of hierarchy. That seems to be
Mhm.
that some people are just better than others. That seems, and
Yeah.
look,
Yeah.
lobsters have hierarchies. The lobsters have hierarchies, so humans should have them, right? You know, and serotonin, they have serotonin in their brains, so they can take antidepressants. They work on lobsters, so some lobsters are better than others. Some people are just naturally superior to others. These, you know, I mean, that's the Jordan Peterson stuff is very toxic, very, very toxic. I plan to do some more rebuttals to that soon.
I want to just briefly say that I totally support that. I'm really glad to hear that you're engaged in that way. I think we need to do more of that, everyone who thinks this way. And I also think that you're right on the money, that basically the way to deal with it is to absolutely compromise not at all on this question of the nature of man. Just keep on fighting for the truth. And the people who can figure it out will figure it out.
Now, this is a question from a good friend of ours, the Flame of Liberation. That's my good friend Nick.
And
Uh, Hi, Nick. Hi, Nick. We're all saying hi. But anyway, he said he asked about thoughts on January 6th. Despite the stupid ideas of most of them, they did something to make the politicians grab their hands. Well, that's not how I would put it. You know, we obviously always, you know, we disavow any illegal activity or any violence of any kind. You know, we favor a peaceful transition to socialism or a better society or whatnot. But what is your reaction to January 6th, Daniel? What do you think of it?
well, I mean, of course, first of all, I totally agree. I feel exactly the same way. There's only creative nonviolence. There's no other possibility. But it's pretty apparent that this is a kind of a Reichstag fire, in the sense that, and I mean that in the specific sense of a so-called disaster that is provoked in order by provoked by the very people uh, who are going to benefit from the increase in power that they can claim on that basis. And so I think this is pretty widely understood. But it's really very scary. In fact, my good friend Diane Sayre, who's running for U.S. Senate in New York, recently attended a vigil for people who have been locked in solitary. Oh, we froze. Okay, I'm here. There
Oh,
were
go ahead.
people, yeah, but she attended a vigil for people who have been locked in terrible conditions since January 6th, who are being treated in a cruel way, absolutely cruel way. So I think that people should acknowledge that that's what's happening, and figure out whatever we can do to stop the destruction of civil liberties that is coming down on our heads.
Right. Well, the idea that it was an attempted coup is absolutely ridiculous.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, a coup would involve the military. You know, Trump would have like psyched up his supporters to do that. I mean, and the Supreme Court was not with Trump. The military brass was not with Trump. This was a protest that got rowdy. And also, you can't just walk into the U.S. Capitol. It's not like they forced their way in there. They were
Mhm.
allowed to get in. And you know, if you bring up at all the fact that there were provocateurs and others among the crowd, we know there were,
Yeah,
right? We know there.
unindicted co-conspirators and so forth.
Yeah. So I mean, was it a demonstration that was very rowdy and violent and illegal? Yes. Was it an attempt to violently overthrow the government? No, no.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with something that some people have said, that we really need a church committee 2.0.
Mm.
That I mean, what's going on is that the whole process of RussiaGate was the FBI, the other security forces, intelligence services, basically trying to take over an unruly president, right, and take over this role of the presidency to the greatest degree that they possibly could, and they succeeded. You know what I mean? So what we're up against is the fact that the U.S. presidency is the pathway for a real transformation of our country, I think. And what's happening instead is that it's been captured once again fully, and clearly Trump became totally captured in his own way in other ways that are not even relevant to Russiagate in a certain sense, but it's been totally captured by these forces, and we actually have to figure out a way to revive the republic. Go on.
Yeah. So now John McCarthy asks, did Bannon or Falun Gong have anything to do with the LaRouche PAC crowd turning against the LaRouche organization? Do you want to answer that?
I have no idea.
Okay. All right. So we'll just skip that. But yeah, let's see what else people are asking about. Well, I mean, when you talk about January 6th and the need for a new what is it called? A new church committee. Yeah, I mean, it's clear there are elements within the government apparatus that are at odds with other ones. There is a fight behind closed doors. There is a battle within the deep state right now. There are different factions that disagree with each other. And, I mean, obviously, you're not a QAnon guy and neither am I. But the fact that all those people were mobilized around the QAnon conspiracy theory, to support certain elements in the government, that shows that there was an active effort by one section of the government to mobilize people to have their back against other sections of the government, right? And I think what the entity that they can call Antifa, there's a lot of heavy infiltration of them as well, and that they are serving another section of the state, and that there is within the power structure there is a fight going on within the ruling class. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think that the people are just, everything is being done to draw people away from substantial efforts to address the collapse of the economy by Wall Street, by the central bankers. I mean, a lot of people talk about what's happening with the COVID, totalitarianism, whatever, things that people are claiming about what the government is doing. It's a lot of terrible things that are happening, but it's important, in my view, to get the context of what's actually spurred all of this, which is it was before the pandemic that there was a meeting at Jackson Hole, August 2019, which is where they always have the Fed summit, and all of the major central bankers were there along with BlackRock. And they got together and said, we're going to have financial regime change, which is a quote from one of the major white papers that was advanced there. And the financial regime change was the central bankers should make all of the decisions for governments about what money they're going to spend. We're not just going to make monetary decisions about how much money to pump and print, but we're also going to decide how it gets spent. And then they, at that same meeting, made a commitment to going basically the Weimar hyperinflation route, which is because they were concerned about sovereign debt, and you can read all of this in major articles by Paul Gallagher in Executive Intelligence Review, but because they were concerned about the major bankruptcy of the system, they said, let's print a bunch of money. And now, in the past several years, it's up to at least 1 in every 5, if not 1 in every 4 US dollar has been printed in the last couple of years. And that they use the excuse of COVID to provide cover for this policy, but that was already the policy, is that we don't have sovereign economics in the United States, or really anywhere in the world except China and Russia and others who are in that same sort of faction. But we do not have it here because we're just having our policies imposed upon us by Bloomberg, Mark Carney, and the other Malthusian oligarchs. That's my view.
Well, very good. Well, I guess we'll wrap up, but this live is about the danger of a new world war. Can you just brief the audience on the danger of a new world war and what we need to do about it?
Yeah, thank you. So there are a series of talks between Russia and NATO and the United States. Why are they happening? Because NATO has expanded eastward, and now, as Putin said, you are at our doorsteps. We have nowhere else to go. So there's a crisis because of this expansion to which NATO is totally devoted and that the United States has been following through on, which includes the idea of not just the coup in Ukraine in 2014 with neo-Nazis taking over the government on the border of Russia, which was provocation enough, and that's what led to the annexation of Crimea. But now we're going even further. We're talking about NATO weaponry, offensive weaponry being placed in Ukraine, Ukraine joining NATO, for example. And the Russians are saying this is like what happened in October of 1962 between the Soviet Union and the United States. At that time, we had John Kennedy, and Khrushchev understood that there was a grave threat of the annihilation of the human species unless you pull back from this and make agreements that would provide the basis for stable peace. Today, that capability, I believe, exists in the US government. I actually believe it exists, but it is not going to come out. It is not going to be realized unless people work towards it, unless people demand it, unless people organize as much as they can, everyone that you know, and go to the people who have voices, who have a potential to do something about it, and demand of them to speak up on it, demand of them to discuss not just the problem, which is crucial, but the solution, which begins with signing the treaties that have been proposed by Russia. They're very reasonable. And they basically say, we're just not going to allow this kind of expansionism. And from the Schiller Institute, we're saying it means you need to have a joint mission, that peace is not the absence of war. Peace is a shared future, that if we scrap NATO, then we need a new inclusive security architecture, which is based on the economic development of the world. And that means begin with Afghanistan, defend the lives there.
Well, very good. The way I usually end my regular streams is I quote a paragraph from one of the last statements of Mao. I usually don't do that with interviews, but I think that's actually very appropriate for this conversation. But I'm going to preface it by pointing out something that's very important, because the word revolution, people don't know what it means. People think that what happened in Kazakhstan is a revolution. It wasn't. That was chaos and violence, right? And wow, I mean, Gleb says there's some disturbing news from Russia, and so we'll have to look into that. I can't comment on that right now. We'll have to look into the facts. But thank you, Gleb, for raising our awareness about that. But the word revolution itself has the connotation of violence and chaos, but it actually comes from the struggle for science, right? The word revolution comes from the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun. And that that was suppressed, and that there was an effort to prevent that from being recognized. But with science and with astronomy, people discovered that the Earth does indeed revolve around the sun. And those who fought for the scientific process and the application of science to running society were called revolutionaries. And in the French Revolution, and then later throughout Europe, the revolutionaries were those who believed in science. So revolution is not about destruction; it is about applying science and reason to the organization of society, and that's an important thing. And that, yes, revolutions can be violent, but in essence, it's about the struggle for science and reason, getting to a higher, more rational stage of society.
Absolutely.
So in that context, I want to quote this paragraph from Mao, and then we'll end. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. So that's the way I end my streams, and that's the way I think we'll end for tonight. Thank you so much, Daniel. It is a pleasure, always a pleasure to interact with you. I wish my best to your family and to everyone you work with. Those of us of many different perspectives, all of us who are against imperialism and the global order and want to stand for peace, we need to come together and work together and cooperate. So thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you for everything you're doing and the CPI is doing. Thank you so much. I think it's vital.
Absolutely. Good night.